Yeah, so I'm part of the biosecurity and biodiversity team, and we're not really known for doing much science ourselves. Normally we take other people's science and we apply it and we go out in the field and we do stuff. But this is one of the rare pieces of research that we have actually been involved in the last year. It's also really hot off the press. We only received this sort of some of the results back in the last week or two, and we're still going over the data. So you're the first people to sort of see this information that's being presented today. So I also need to make some acknowledgements. We haven't done the research. Wildlands have been doing a lot of the research on our behalf. So there's a team of ecologists and GIS specialists at Wildlands. And this research has also been a joint collaboration with all of the other councils. So we've had funding from SDC, GDC and ICC, as well as Environment Southland to do this research. So this has been a big project supported by a lot of different people. So the main messages that I want you to think about and take away today is that Indigenous biodiversity across Southland has declined since humans have arrived, and that the small fragments that we have left is really important. So the little bit of Kakatea forest that you can see in the picture in front of the pine forest, it might not look like much, it might look like a scruffy patch of bush. Is actually really important. There's not much of it left. So just because something doesn't look big and exciting doesn't mean it's not important. And to really understand how important these things are, we still need to do a lot more research and gather a lot more information to really increase our understanding. So the work that we're presenting today is the first stage of a much bigger process that we're about to go through. So a little bit of background. I've taken this graph from a doc paper, but there's been a massive decline in biodiversity, in all types of biodiversity, in our plants, in our animals, throughout the whole of New Zealand. But we haven't really got much information, or haven't had, on actually what's happening in Southland, so Southland specific information. And that's a bit of a problem for us as a regional council and for the district councils, because we all have a mandate to maintain our Indigenous biodiversity. If we don't know what our Indigenous biodiversity is and what should be here, then how are we ever going to maintain it? So we've put together a project to try and find out a little bit more about what we would have had, and then what's left, where it is, and what are the threats and solutions that we need to go through to improve the situation. So what's this project about? Well, we've been doing some research into 3 sets of ecological maps. The first one is trying to work out what would Southland have looked like before humans arrived. So taking soil data, topography data, any ecological reports that we do have, as much information as we could to try and map actually what would Southland, or what did Southland look like before humans were here. So it's a little bit of a guesstimate in places, but it gives us a starting point about what are we trying to maintain. The second stage, or the second set of maps that we've put together, is of that, what's left? So where do we actually have Indigenous biodiversity left? And of that, of everything that's left, what is significant, what is important? And the criteria we've used to determine what significant is actually laid out in our regional policy statement, which gives us 4 different things that we need to be looking at when we're deciding if something's significant, if something's important. And that's, is it representative of a Southland ecosystem? Is it rare? Is it distinct? What's its diversity like and its patterns like? Is it fragmented? Is it part of a wider ecosystem? And what's its wider ecological context? So we've already got some things laid out in our policy statement of how we actually determine what significance is. Also important to think about the fact that biodiversity isn't just on land, it's also in our freshwater and marine areas. So when we're talking about Southland in this context, we've actually been trying to map the whole of Southland, including the CMA, so terrestrial, freshwater and marine. So it's quite a large bit of work that's been put together. And so this is the results of where we've got to so far. This is the first terrestrial map of what we think Southland could have looked like before humans arrived. Each of the different colours, and I'm not sure how well it's showing on the screens, I don't know if we want to turn the lights out a bit, but each of the different colours is a different ecosystem. We've used classification called Singers and Rogers classification that was developed by Department of Conservation to actually name our ecosystems. when we're talking about ecosystems, it's important that we're all talking about the same thing. And each of the regional councils throughout the country has agreed that we'll use this same classification model. So that when we're talking about a Manuka-type forest, when Otago's talking about Manuka-type forest, when Auckland's talking about it, we're all actually talking the same language and we're talking about the same things. So the maps that we've produced can be slotted together with every other regional council's map, and the whole country will be mapped and all the languages the same and the classifications mean the same thing. So as you can see, there's a lot of forest types. The light green is Silver Beach, mountain beech forest types. We've got lots of darker green, so a different forest type on the lowland plains, and the brown that goes through down the river corridors would have been to hectare forest, and scree and things on the uplands. When we started looking at the marine area, we realised that actually DOC had already done the work for us, so thank you to any DOC people that are in the room, and they'd already mapped what the probable ecosystems in the marine environment were. So we've been able to use the research that DOC have done on that. And then we started looking at, okay, what's left? So to do this, we've taken a look at aerial photography, taken a look at the land cover database, slotted it over the map of what we thought was here, slotted the two maps together and come up with what's left. Now the map on the left-hand side, or the far map, it includes the DOC estate. So you can see Fiordland, we've got lots of representative of that really green colour, that Silver Beach mountain forest, and then but the rest of the area that's not in Fiordland is pretty blank. So if you take out land that is protected by DOC, you get the second map, which is all of the fragments that are left on private land and left on land that's not being currently protected by the DOC estate. And one of the things that we're going to be looking at is what does that mean in terms of those ecosystems? When we've really interrogated the data, are there any ecosystems that are not on the DOC estate and that are just found in those fragments on private land? And we think that there will be. We haven't really gone through the data yet, but there'll be a couple of them that are only found on private land. If you remember from that original map, there was the big swathes of Kahikatea forest all down through the southern plains, the big brown swathes. They're pretty much gone when you look at this second map. So the tiny fragments of that are left, that's all there is left now in Southland. And that's a really important part of the message, is that just because 50% of our region is covered by this DOC estate doesn't mean that actually all of our ecosystems and all of our biodiversity is being protected within that estate. We didn't look at the marine for this stage of the research because the advice was that actually we're unable to show the areas of the marine environment that have been impacted by humans are so small it wouldn't show on a map of this stage, so where dredging and things have happened. But the next stage of the project was that third one. What is actually important of those? These little fragments that are left, what is really important? So we think there's about 130,000 hectares of potentially significant vegetation left on private land, and that's actually quite a lot. It's really good. It's just all there in tiny fragments. There's probably over 3,000 little tiny fragments, and we need to start working out how we build those connections together, how we make sure those fragments are big enough to be self-sustaining and so that they're going to be there forever and be able to be retained. And when we looked at the marine side, it actually turned out that when we applied those criteria over the marine environment, everywhere we had information for came back as significant, so it met one of those criteria. So actually, in terms of ecological significance, our entire marine environment is ecologically significant. So what do we do now? One of the first things, and it's around building connections with people, is actually how do we work with landowners to help them understand that that tiny piece of Ko-Fi forest that doesn't look like much, that little couple of Kikateas they've got in the paddock, how do we work with people to understand how important they are and that that is the only fragment that's left across Southland? How do we help them look after it? It's also going to be really important to ground truth those maps. There's a lot of information in them. It's come from historical reports, it's come from what we can see in aerial photography, things like that. But without even really getting onto the ground, we're not going to know if that map's accurate and whether just because we think it is actually Silver Beach Forest, it is Silver Beach Forest. So there's a lot of work to go into to find that out. And then we have to be realistic about how we go and look after these areas. If we've got over 3,000 little fragments left, we can't, as a regional council, look after all of them. We probably can't, as Southland, look after all of them. So how do we start prioritising where we go to first? Where do we start looking at first? Where do we start building those connections and start adding things up? So we've got a big process that we're going to go through over the next couple of years, doing a prioritisation project, putting each of these blocks, doing a condition assessment, looking at them, what management do they need, what can we do to help them and move forward. So in conclusion, we've just been trying to build up a bit of a picture of what's been changing in Southland and what the current state of our biodiversity is like. It's becoming really clear that those small fragments on private land are going to be absolutely essential if we are going to maintain the whole region's biodiversity. We also have to be quite careful about the way we use some of the data, particularly when we've gone and ground truthed information, and making sure that we have landowner permission, that they know what data is being used for and how it fits into the wider picture, and any ways that it could be published in future. And yeah, so the data does have some privacy issues around it that we need to work through, and we need to make sure that landowners are aware of what they've got on their land and why it's special. There's also a really big peer review project that's still needed. So as I said, this is really fresh off the press, this research, so we need to go through and check everything out and check that we've actually got it right. And there is a little bit of a gap analysis that needs to be done in terms of which areas we weren't able to get any information on and how we start filling in some of the other information.
Environment Southland.